Earlier this year, my family and I moved to the southeast part of Colorado Springs. That's a beautifully diverse part of the city with amazing views of the mountains. But it's also a land of expansive parking lots, tired-looking strip malls, and residential areas that are largely separate from pretty much anything that's within walking distance. So when my family and I moved to this part of town, there was something a little bit different that stood out. Large, empty, commercial lot, not too far from our new home. I began to think of it as a blank canvas, an opportunity for something a little bit different in our part of town. Now, I'm not a city planner, but as long as I can remember, I've thought about what it is exactly that makes a city great. A great place to experience as a visitor or as a resident. You see, I think about experience a lot in my line of work. I'm a user experience designer for software products. Now, real quick, user experience design is not just about the visual side or the aesthetic of a piece of software. No, user experience design is really all about the human being on the other side of the software, the end user. It's all about understanding this end user's behaviors, understanding of the world, sort of the language that they speak in interacting with other things on the web and other software that they use. It's about understanding their needs and their goals. Also that we can create software that's empowering, maybe even more fulfilling for them. So I began to think of how we might apply these human-centered design principles to how we design our physical spaces around us, in our cities and in our neighborhoods. Now, the first step, and arguably the most important, is to understand that human being that comes into contact with our cities. Now, in software, we typically come up with maybe 1 to 5 typical user profiles that are based on behaviors or roles and responsibilities within an organization or a society, their backgrounds, and so on. But when it comes to a city, it becomes much more complex. You see, we have people who are visiting a city from out of town just for a weekend, and families who've been established in a community for generations. There are folks at all different points along a socioeconomic spectrum. There are those who have different career paths, worldviews, belief systems, goals, needs, frustrations. But there are a few things that we all share in common. We all need access to food, clean water, shelter. We all need a way to get from one place to another. But aside from these basic physiological needs that we all have, we all need healthy social interaction. We all need a sense of belonging to a community and to a place. We all need opportunities for meaningful work and self-expression. And we all need a sense of purpose, a sense that we're living for something beyond ourselves. And the physical space in which we live can either detract from or enhance these pursuits. Now, the next step of the design process would be to understand the problem that we're facing in our cities around the globe. See, after the Industrial Revolution, our cities began to implement zoning policies. It made a lot of sense at the time. You didn't want to have factories spewing toxic chemicals into a neighborhood right next door where you're raising your children. But our zoning policies have done much more than simply separate away these industrial areas from the rest of a city. These policies have partitioned our cities into residential areas, commercial areas, central business districts, arts and entertainment districts, and so on. So we end up with some negative consequences to our society, thanks to these zoning policies and increased use of the personal automobile. You get scenes like this. Large expanses of homes, separate from anything within walking distance that has meaning to how we live our lives. So in order to get to a store, a workplace, a community gathering place, we end up having to hop in our cars and travel 15, 30, 60, maybe even 90 minutes to get to some of these places. I call this a destination culture. It's a culture in which we spend very little time within our own neighborhoods. And our cities are much more designed around the machines that we use, our vehicles, rather than around us, the citizens, the human beings, and our needs. And our cultures end up becoming much more transactional in nature. And instead of our communities being based off of proximity, they become much more about affinity. Which raises some interesting questions. How do we love our neighbor if we don't even know him? And how do we tackle these big community issues that we're facing if we don't have a sense of belonging to our communities that's based on personal relationships? But there's some other negative aspects to the user experience of a destination culture as well. When we're all trying to get from point A to point B in our cars, we end up with traffic jams. Increased time isolated in our car bubbles, away from friends and family and meaningful activities. And those who are left without access to a vehicle for whatever reason are also left without access to many other important things in life. Things like opportunities for work and opportunities to get to some of these social gatherings. But let's begin to move into the solution space. Now, I began to take inspiration from mixed-use communities around the country that I've visited or frequented over the years. Places like 12 South in Nashville, Ivywild in Colorado Springs, and Fremont in Seattle. Now, in a place like Fremont, there are residences surrounding a sort of cultural and commercial mini hub that looks a lot like a couple main streets. So within walking distance from these homes, you have access to opportunities for entrepreneurship and cultural expression through weekend markets and events that take place throughout the year. You have access to meaningful jobs, like a chocolate factory and an international software company. And you have access to social gathering places like pubs and coffee shops. So I began to draw inspiration from places like Fremont and think of how we might apply a similar mixed-use model to suburbia, to the sprawl. Began to think about what it might look like to repurpose abandoned shopping malls. What it might look like to use some of the space now taken up by unsightly parking lots. And I began to think about what it might look like to implement this sort of planning philosophy as our cities continue to grow and expand in new development. And finally, I began to think of what it might look like in this large, empty commercial lot near our new home in Southeast Colorado Springs. I began to think about social gathering places that could go in this lot, like an amphitheater, like parks, like coffee shops and pubs. I began to think about access to government services within walking distance. I began to think about access to entrepreneurship through lower barrier to entry venues, such as tiny house businesses and creative co-working space. But I don't see this as one isolated, new, trendy area of a city. If that's how we continue to implement this mixed-use model, it could actually add to some of the sociological stress that we have in our cities. No, I see this as more of a new normal. I imagine a network of these mini hubs throughout a city so that a majority of residents can have access within walking distance to all of these things that we need for life. And I see these neighborhoods being connected through meaningful transit lines that are more cost-efficient, more innovative, more natural, more human. I think of repurposing our arterial roadways to have bike paths and trees side by side with more innovative transportation, perhaps light rail lines or a technology that we haven't thought of yet. But really, this is just one man's vision, perhaps a framework for how we view our cities of the future. But I'd really like to invite all of us into this space of human-centered community design. I'd like us all to consider the people around us who are coming into contact with our neighborhoods and our cities. I'd like us all to consider and research and understand the problems that we're facing, whether they be unique to the communities and cities that we're in, or shared by many of the cities that we come in contact with around the globe. And then I'd like us all to move into this space as creatives, as innovators, as entrepreneurs, as neighbors, of ideating innovative solutions to these problems that we're facing, implementing, testing, and iterating along the way. So I'd like to leave us with one final challenge in the spirit of those famous words of John F. Kennedy. I'd like to challenge us to ask not what our cities and our neighborhoods can do for us, but what we can do to design better experiences for all who come in contact with them. Thank you.